Hey everybody, Brian here. Today we're going to talk about a crazily important topic, and that is drum mapping in Logic. I guess what we're doing is similar to what the Vikings were doing in the 8th or 9th centuries when they found some old maps, began dreaming of new destinations, new conquests. Now, what we're doing isn't quite that grandiose, but I think even the Vikings would agree, and maybe by the end of this video you'll agree, that what we're doing is still pretty epic. Our destination is drum mapping the way you've always wanted it. Over the past month, I've created a MIDI script that'll pretty much map Logic drums to any imaginable third-party plugin, including all the kind of functionality you would expect, like making sure hi-hats are opening and closing properly, and a whole bunch of other super useful functions. So let me take you on this wild journey. So let's take a look at drum mapping, why it's so important, and why it's actually so difficult to properly map from Logic to a third-party drum library. Alright, here in Logic you're seeing a track that has Logic Drummer on it, which is playing back through the drum kit designer. I have this set up as an input mapping to GM plus mod wheel, controls hi-hat. If you do that, you'll see these hi-hat articulations named as hi-hat tip, hi-hat shank, hi-hat edge. And what I've done here on these drummer sessions is I've gradually increased the complexity and intensity over time across these 4-bar segments. And I've also adjusted the hi-hat patterns so that over time I can see as many different hi-hat articulations as possible, because that's one of the most important parts about doing drum mapping is getting the hi-hats right. So let's just take a quick listen. Okay, that's enough for now. You get the point. You can hear some hi-hat variation there, and obviously if you're going to do a drum map, you want that hi-hat variation to be preserved as well as possible in the target library. Now, if we were to try to play that back in Addictive Drums, for instance, using its Logic MIDI map, which is under MIDI mapping, other plugins, Logic Drum Kit Designer, you're going to notice something is really off. The thing I want to bring your attention to is the fact that the hi-hats aren't doing anything. They're only playing single articulations. They're either open or closed and nothing in between. And that's what we really want to fix. And so when people say online, hey, the best way to map Logic drums to a third party is just either use a GM map or use a third party's plugin, Logic specific map, but those approaches are never going to result in the hi-hats playing back correctly. At the end of all this, you're going to see how I'm using a custom designed MIDI script that I wrote to achieve the kind of MIDI mapping that you've dreamed of. So here I am in Addictive Drums, and this time I'm going to set the MIDI mapping to 82 standard, which has all the available articulations. And don't you agree that this sounds a lot better than what we just heard? You can probably hear that difference right away. The hi-hats are now opening and closing. So let's see how we arrived here. I'm going to convert these drummer sessions to MIDI. And I'm going to join all these regions together. Now notice how what we see in terms of the hi-hats is we have hi-hat tip articulations and hi-hat edge. The shank articulations are not used by drummer, it seems. And in a minute you'll see why. Now if we select all these hi-hat notes and then view the event list, notice how you see all these articulations such as something in the 30s or 20s or the 10s. This is a really peculiar thing, and it took me a while to figure out what was going on and decode all this. So basically what Drummer is doing is it's using these articulation IDs 10, 11, 12, 13, 20, 21, 22, 23, 30, 31, 32, and 33 to control open and close separately for a hi-hat tip, hi-hat shank, and hi-hat edge. So to see things more clearly what's going on, here I've broken out some articulations, hi-hat tips, as well as the hi-hat edge hits. And for the first three, I've assigned articulation IDs 10, 11, 12. And then for the next four, I've assigned 10, 11, 12, 13. And what you're going to see is that for these three down here, those are closed-ish kind of hits. And then the next four are open-ish. And then collectively, these seven take you from closed all the way to full open. And when using these articulation IDs in the 10s, that is for the hi-hat tip. So even though we're seeing these edge articulations, these are actually just controlling hi-hat tip. And then these next ones here, where I'm using in the 20s, 20, 21, 22, and 23, those are actually controlling hi-hat shank. So these three are for closed-ish kind of sounds, and then the next four are for open sounds, ending with the full open. And then likewise, when we get into 30s, we're controlling the hi-hat edge articulations, where 30, 31, and 32, when entered as a hi-hat tip, that's actually hi-hat edge, closed sounds, and then the next four, 30 through 33, those are the open sounds. So let's just take a listen to all this together. Now I know this sounds a little bit like black magic, but this is truly what's going on behind the scenes. So when drummer outputs these notes and these AIDs, there's a little bit of a handoff going on so the drum kit designer knows what to actually play. Continuing on this little journey, we can actually open up a drum kit designer kit in Sampler. So to do that, you just click on where it says drum kit and then change that to Sampler. And I've already done that. I have that on a separate track. And if you do that and open up Sampler and go to the mapping and group section, enable by articulation. To do that, you go to view, visible group list columns, and make sure that's checked off. And here we see these AIDs 1 through 7 that Sampler knows how to use for these hi-hat open 1 through open 7, which correspond to fully closed to fully open, the 7 levels of open to closedness. And what we have here are those drummer AIDs in the 10s, 20s, and 30s. But if we try to play this back in Sampler, there won't be any output, because Sampler has no idea what to do with those AIDs. It only understands 1 through 7. So in the end, when Drum Kit Designer is using these AIDs in the 10s, 20s, and 30s, as well as those hi-hat shank and the hi-hat edge notes, it's actually remapping the notes and the AIDs so that they make more sense in Sampler. So here is what ultimately gets played back in Sampler. I've just changed these AIDs. So if we open event list, it's kind of hard to see these articulations. They have these weird entries here. So let me just actually change this back from Sampler to Drum Kit Designer. It won't make any difference for these purposes. Make sure this is in GM Mod Wheel view. So I'm using articulations 1 through 7 for the hi-hat tip, also 1 through 7 for the shank, and 1 through 7 for the edge. Now if we play this back in Sampler, it knows what to do with these AIDs. So figuring out that mapping that Logic does internally to take drummer outputted notes and AIDs, translate them into notes and AIDs that Sampler knows how to use, you would think we now can play back in a third-party library and something might happen. The thing is, those libraries don't understand AIDs. And Logic Drummer nor the Drum Kit Designer are producing the continuous control messages that actually would be needed to play back in a third-party library. For instance, if I change this from Sampler to Addictive Drums, and choose the Logic Drum Kit Designer, MIDI input mode for Addictive Drums2. If I play back, you'll see what happens. The There's no opening or closing going on, it's just playing the same articulation each time, because the AID information is completely useless to the third-party library. So you might have guessed what actually has to happen. You need to add the foot opening control data, which is what those AIDs 1 through 7 are actually doing. They're accomplishing an opening and closing in this type of fashion. Now, for a third-party library to do anything with these notes and this CC foot control data, we need to make sure that in the library, those notes are set up to receive those CC messages. So here I'm in the Addictive Drums2 standard map, and it has those CC controller notes down here as notes 7, 8, and 9. But I'm just going to change those so they match up to what we see here, just so I can show you what's going on. So we're going to change the tip to be F#1. We'll change this one, hi-hat shaft CC control, to be G#1. And then for the hi-hat bell CC control, we'll make that A#1. So now we have this hi-hat tip, it's note 42, shaft 44, bell 46. And that corresponds to these notes here, F#1, G#1, and A#1. So now if we play back, so that's what we need. So to summarize this weirdness, we started with a drummer track, and we understood what it was doing with the hi-hats in terms of using these AIDs in the 10s, 20s, and 30s, which it does in these strange 2-note pairings. And then from there, I determined that what's really going on is that those notes are remapped in this way, where the AIDs are changed to be 1 through 7 for each of these hi-hat articulations. And then knowing that, we played back those notes in the third-party library using CC control data to gradually open up the hi-hats. So I'm in Addictive Drums2, and I want to show you something because things aren't quite as they seem. If we go into the MIDI mapping, you'll see that Addictive Drums, it doesn't use 7 levels for close and open. It has 2 close articulations, 4 open. So actually, to truly do this right, you would have to figure out a way to map the 7 open, close levels in Logic to however many levels are in the third-party plugin. And not only that, you have to determine where these levels fall. Now, I've gone ahead and actually done that. So for several third-party libraries, I figured out which CC levels correspond to which of their hi-hat articulations. So ultimately, this is what the script does. This is how it handles the opening and closing of the hi-hat and sending the right levels. So lucky for you, I've already done all that detective work. So in my Logic Drums to Anything instruction guide, in the appendices, I go over all these various nuances with third-party drum libraries. So for instance, with EZDrummer, I know that we have these different levels that correspond to its 2 close articulations, and then its open articulations. Likewise with Addictive Drums, I know how it is handling various CC values and how those map to its hi-hat articulations, the 2 close, and then the open ones. And I've done the same thing for Slate Drums, which uses these types of articulations, and also a Studio Drummer, which doesn't use CC control at all for a couple of its articulations. In any case, maybe you can appreciate the idea now. So most of them are pretty similar. They have a couple closed kind of articulations and then some open, and it's just a matter of experimenting to figure out which of the CC values trigger which. And so now you kind of see that the more and more we look into this, the more complicated it becomes, and that's the whole motivation behind writing a script that handles all this for you. So really, we don't have to touch anything in the third-party library except for just keeping it to its standard map. No need to choose any special logic map if there is one. No need to choose general MIDI. All of these plugins have their own standard default kind of MIDI input map. What does this all mean for you? Well, the script is going to take however many hi-hat open-close levels it has, map those to CC values that then result in it having some kind of correspondence with Logic's 7 levels for hi-hat open control. But that's not the only thing we want the script to do. I'm back in Addictive Drums, which is a good example of a pretty extensive library with a lot of capabilities. And if we go under its MIDI mapping section, you'll notice in addition to having CC control for the hi-hat, it also has position control for the snare, as well as for 2 ride cymbals. And it also has cymbal chokes, which it can handle by aftertouch or with an articulation. And not all libraries have all these features, but I wanted to build a script that could work for pretty much any imaginable library and be able to handle that kind of functionality. So with that said, now we're going to get into the script, how it works, as well as some of the additional features. Here we are back in Logic. I've loaded Addictive Drums on a track, as well as MIDI Scripter, which is one of Logic's MIDI plugins. And there I've loaded my script, which I'll open up. Now there's a lot going on, but for the most part, you only have to care about 4 variables. You don't have to worry about any of the actual code, the implementation. You just worry about some setup information. So let's go through that. The first thing is this CC ranges variable that tells the script how it should deal with CC control data. This CC ranges variable is actually optional. You only have to use it if you plan on making use of CC controllable articulations in the third-party library. The number on the far left, those are CC numbers, so 4 for foot control for hi-hat, 16 for snare position control, 17 for ride control. I could even add 18 here because Addictive Drums has an additional ride control. But in any case, you get the idea. And then these numbers here are articulation IDs. So these are the 7 that deal with hi-hat control in Logic. And then for 16, I've added a couple AIDs. I notice Logic sometimes outputs 0 or 2. Maybe in the future they plan on using those AIDs for its snare. So I've just added them here so they can be used in some way if needed. And likewise for the ride control, I've just arbitrarily assigned an AID 1 for this range, 2 for this range. And the ranges are pretty self-explanatory. Numbers from 0 to 127. And if we look at my instruction guide under Addictive Drums, I show the actual values that it uses for CC control and how it maps to its own hi-hat articulations. So what I've done in Logic is I came up with one way to try to map to these. Obviously it's not a one-to-one because there are 6 articulations in Addictive Drums, 7 in Logic, but I have the Open D, which is the full open, that's mapping 1-to-1 to Logic's AID 7, and then HH close 1 to Open A in Addictive Drums. I have those mapping 1-to-1 to Logic's AID 1, 2, and 3, and then 4, 5, and 6, those are going to match to HH Open B or C. And then in Addictive Drums, it uses the full range, 0 to 127 for snare control and ride control. Basically it does a crossfade, so 0 is the complete full center snare or the shaft sample for the ride, and then 127 if we're talking about snare, that's the full edge, and then if we're talking about ride, 127 is the full tip, and then anything in between from 1 to 126 for both the snare and the ride position control, those are going to amount to gradual crossfades of the 2 sample types. And obviously depending on the target library, these would change a bit. So if you're using EZDrummer, it has 8 hi-hat articulations between open and closed. So in that case, you would be mapping 7 Logic articulations to 8 in EZDrummer. And in the guide, I show one way I go about that. If you're in Slate Drums, you have yet another case where it has 1 closed articulation and then these incrementally more open articulations. Again, we have to map 7 from Logic, 6 into Slate, and I have one example of that in the guide. And likewise with Studio Drummer, it has 5 articulations that are controlled by the CC. And then it also has 2 closed articulations, which are not mapped. So basically only AIDs 3 through 7 in Logic we map to open sounds in Studio Drummer. 1 and 2 don't use CC. And in the example scripts I have, these are also set up with the target plugin in mind. And continuing along here, this variable L stands for Logic. So in theory, this could be any source plugin, really. But I'm using Logic here. So these are the notes that you see in Drum Kit Designer when you choose the MIDI mode to GMCC. And depending on the target library, you might also have a shaker you'll map to, cowbells, hand claps, etc. So this is pretty self-explanatory. Just give it some useful name for the input note and enter the actual MIDI note here, like so. Then likewise, you need to specify the target plugin notes. Here are all the notes in Addictive Drums in its standard MIDI layout. It also has these flexi hits. Some of them I've mapped in Addictive Drums. I placed hand claps, tambourine, cowbell on some of those. So that gives you an idea in Addictive Drums how to add additional samples to map up to Logic. And in Addictive Drums, depending on the kit you have, these will play different roles. There's a maximum of 6 different cymbals you'll see, and sometimes one of them will be a china, one of them will be a splash. For setting up this script, I just used the Addictive Drums Pseudo Rock Hard Rock kit, but other kits might be different, so you have to just double check, make sure things match up. Regardless of the kit, they should have all these available notes, and then it's just a matter of which kits use which notes and how different kits use the cymbals differently. You would do likewise with any other target library, be it EZDrummer, Superior Drummer, even Slate Drums, or whatever. Just figure out its articulations and write them out. My example scripts already have those written out, so that gives you a good starting point. And then the magic happens through this variable called drummer to target. Though it isn't just drummer that can be used. This is general enough to be used for any input drum library. Now in the most basic usage, all you're going to do is map some input to an output. And so on the left we have the Logic note names, and if you're going to map 2 Logic notes to the same target note, you can just comma separate them or add separate entries, however you want. And so this is the most basic type of map, some Logic note to some target plugin note. And you can also specify multiple target notes. So for instance, if we go down to some of these tom hits, I'm setting one of Logic's low toms to be either the tom 4 open hit or the tom 4 rim shot, which means one of them will get randomly chosen. That's a pretty neat feature, huh? And you can use this optional notation with a colon followed by a number that specifies likelihood of occurrence weights. So colon 4 here compared to colon 1 here, that means this open hit is 4 times more likely to be chosen randomly. You can also just leave those out, and then they'll both have equal likelihood. So if we had a bunch of these F1 hits in Logic, which is the tom low, and we played that back, we'll see the script in action. So you see sometimes I was playing back an open hit, sometimes a rim shot. There's also a parameter called AID switch, which just does basic articulation switching. So based on a Logic AID, you specify a target note. And so these AIDs can be comma separated, like so. What this is saying is anytime there's an AID 0 or 1, make that play back the snare open hit in this target plugin, and Addictive Drums in this case. Anytime there's a 2, playback as a snare shallow hit. This feature, AID switch, is going to be super useful if you plan on doing percussion mapping, as I'll show at the end of this video. Now one way you could use this AID switch is you could use it to apply selective processing. So maybe you want to randomize something, but only when you decide to. So let's say I want to randomize various tom fills. So now I'm going into the MIDI, I've selected a bunch of tom hits, and now I'm going to bring up the event list. I could change all those AIDs. I could set those all to 1. And then in the script, for all these tom hits, I've added this AID switch. And for an AID of 1 in each case, it's going to do the same kind of thing that I mentioned earlier when you use multiple notes for a target note. It's going to randomly pick one or the other, an open hit or a rim shot. In each case, with the open hit being 2 times more likely than the rim shot. So anyway, it's just one possibility. And now there's a parameter called AID map, and that's especially needed for mapping drummer output to be played back in a third-party plugin, so all is well with the hi-hats. And so what this does is it takes a Logic articulation ID and then maps that to some Logic note and possibly to some Logic AID. The AID is optional, but in the case of hi-hat mapping, based on my experimentation and what I determined is going on in DKD in its handoff to sampler, this is exactly what's going on. Here are those 10s, 20s, 30s that we saw earlier, and how an HH tip note is sometimes actually being remapped to a shank, an edge. Likewise, an edge note is sometimes being remapped to a tip or shank. And in the end, no matter what we see in terms of these drummer AIDs, they're being remapped into the AIDs that sampler knows how to use, 1 through 7. It's It's important to notice the flow of things here, especially when using AID map. So if you have an HH tip with an AID of 22 coming out of drummer, it's going to be remapped into the note HH shank. It's going to be given the AID 3. And so the way the target note is determined is you would go to HH shank, and it doesn't have anything specified for AID 3 to perform articulation switching on that. So it's just going to look at the target note, which is CCHH tip. And with Addictive Drums, there are 3 different hi-hat articulations that can be controlled by a continuous controller. There's a tip, a shaft, and a bell, but I just used the tip for both Logic's tip and its shank because I just felt these sonically matched up better. But I could have also chosen that CCHH bell that's in Addictive Drums2. In any case, so that's the flow of things. That's how the target note is ultimately determined. Okay, I went ahead and changed that HH shank mapping from Logic to be CCHH bell in Addictive Drums2. Anyway, what I wanted to just talk about real quick is the CC num. I'm going to talk more about that in a bit, but the most obvious use, of course, is with opening and closing hi-hats, which often uses CC controller number 4. You could also use 1. They tend to do the same thing in the target plugins. So with these HH articulations, each one I'm telling it to use CC number 4. So after that logical flow of things that I just described, and there's ultimately some AID assigned, what's going to happen, say for an instance of that AID 3, the script is going to look at that CC num, which was 4, and then it's going to look at the AID 3 and see what the value range is for that CC controller. And for this case, it's going to be from 64 to 80, which is going to correspond, in this case, to a hi-hat open A articulation in Addictive Drums2. So ultimately, whatever AID is being assigned, if there is an entry for it here, that's going to result in a CC value being generated randomly from the given range. So having set up the script with the AID map parameters as needed for the hi-hat articulations, now we can return to these MIDI notes, which are using those articulation IDs in the 10s, 20s, and 30s, which is Logic Drummer's way of playing the HH tip, HH shank, and HH edge articulations. And by the way, using this AID map, it won't break things if you had a MIDI part that didn't come from Drummer and you were just using AIDs 1 through 7 for the HH tip, HH shank, and HH edge. It'll work either way. So we'll play back this in Addictive Drums so you see what happens. So you see things being mapped here in Addictive Drums2 properly as needed. So Logic 7 levels for controlling open hi-hat and being mapped into the target plugin's 6 levels here. You would see something similar in a different target plugin. This idea is generalized across any target plugin you have in mind. So we can do the same thing, play back with articulations 1 through 7, just straight out using the HH tip, HH shank, and HH edge articulations in Logic, and you'll notice the same exact result. So hopefully now you understand how this mapping works, especially for the case of hi-hats. I know it can be a little confusing, so hopefully seeing it in action helps make it more understandable. There's another thing worth mentioning here, and I know this is a long video, but there are just a ton of nuances to the script. So say you had MIDI that you had manually created, you have your own foot control data or some other CC control data like I'm showing here. You don't have to use AIDs. The script won't break. It's just going to pass through what you already did, and the playback will be as you expect. So here I've just zeroed out those articulation IDs. That's what those dashes mean in Logic. So they're set to 0. The script won't do anything with those. You're just going to pass through that control data. It's going to still map these Logic notes to the right notes in the target plugin. So we play that back, and there'll be no surprises. So there you go, just wanted to show you that. And then another parameter called AID assign. Now AID switch actually expects there to already be some articulation IDs assigned to the incoming MIDI notes that the script is processing. But you can also just automatically assign AIDs. What this does is it says Okay, automatically the AID is going to be either 1 or 2. The AID is this first number, so to the left of the colon, and then after the colon is a weight, similar to the probability of occurrence weights that I talked about a moment ago. It's optional. You could just enter it that way, and then either AID 1 or 2 will be assigned randomly with equal likelihood. But I'll keep them this way so that AID 1 has a 2 times more likelihood than AID 2. And now what that means is, let's say that a 1 gets assigned as the AID. The next thing the script is going to do is see, is there an AID switch telling us what to do in the case of an AID 1? In this case there is. It means the snare open hit will be played. If an AID of 2 is assigned, that also already corresponds to a note to be played back. That's going to be the snare shallow hit. By the way, if I added another AID here, say 88, because the AID switch doesn't say what to do, if there's an AID of 88, that's just going to default to what you put in for the target note. There's also a parameter called CC_num, which relates back to that CC ranges parameter that we looked at earlier. This is for mapping AIDs to a CC controller for any articulations in a target plugin that supports the use of CC control data. So opening and closing hi-hat, snare position control, ride position, and so on. That number 4 corresponds to 4 here. And with the snare, in a target plugin like Addictive Drums2, it can control the position of the snare using CC number 16, for instance. That's what this note is here in Addictive Drums. And even though I'm talking a lot about Addictive Drums, everything I'm mentioning applies to any given plugin if it supports this kind of functionality. So with that, when we go back to the script, for the center articulation, I'm specifying CC16, as well as that snare CC POS open SHA, and likewise for the edge. The only thing that's different is I'm using this AID assign parameter. For the center it's 1, for edge it's 2, and if we go up to this CC ranges parameter, we see for CC16, when there's an AID 1, that's going to correspond to some sort of center-ish hit being played back, depending on the CC value that's randomly chosen in that range. So that's for the center articulations. And then with an AID 2, that's going to result in the upper end of the CC range, which corresponds to edge-ish hits. So that way now when we have these snare edge and snare center hits, and when those articulations get played back in Addictive Drums through the script, we're going to see the snare position varying. So it's a good way to get more out of the target plugin. And then for the ride cymbal, I just chose ride out, assign the target note to the ride 1 position control that controls between shaft and tip hits. So what this is doing is it's going to assign either AID 1 or 2. AID 2, that'll be chosen 3 times more likely than AID 1. The CC number is 17. So if we go up here, AID 2 corresponds to the tip. And so when this ride out note is seen coming into the script, what will be outputted is this articulation in the target library with CC data that's going to either make it play back as a tip kind of sound or a shaft kind of ride sound. And now if we had a bunch of ride out articulations, this is that D sharp number 2 note in Logic, and play that back through the script, through Addictive Drums anyway, we would see this kind of result. So similar to the kind of action we saw with the snare, taking advantage of its ability to use a CC controller to vary those hits. Another parameter, chokes. I'll talk about this ride choke nonsense in a bit. Logic doesn't have a ride choke, but there's a way we can implement that. First, let's just talk about a plain old crash choke. So Logic uses these stop articulations, and in Addictive Drums, it has choke articulations. So one thing you can do is just specify which Logic note it chokes. In this case, it's crash left. The target note says which notes are the choke notes in the target plugin. So because right now we're talking about crash left, which I'm assigning either cymbal 1 or cymbal 5, the target choke notes correspond to the cymbal 1 choke and the cymbal 5 choke. See that correspondence there? And now what I did was to add an additional note in Logic just for testing purposes and to show you how this works. I called it crash left stop underscore AT. That's what this is. chose some unused note, in this case A#4, and then AT stands for aftertouch. And so if you wanted to have Logic's crash left stop trigger aftertouch in the target plugin, you just enter the chokes parameter the way we did it previously, but now you add :AT at the end. That tells the script to use channel aftertouch. And then this right stop, notice how it ends with :PT. That's telling the script to use poly aftertouch. And in both cases, if you're using these aftertouch methods, you don't have to choose a target note because aftertouch and polytouch, they don't send notes, they just send aftertouch data. And you can do something similar with ride choking. Logic doesn't have that internally, but let's say you just wanted to invent in Logic a ride choke note. So I've assigned A5, some unused note. I've called it ride choke. Then you could edit the MIDI if you wanted to, add that note anywhere you want to choke a ride hit. And like we did for the cymbal case, you just enter the parameter chokes and you tell it what to choke. This is kind of a nuance. You don't have to worry too much about it. It doesn't really matter too much what you put here. All that matters is the target note, because this ride 1 choke in Addictive Drums, it's going to choke any possible ride note. But just for readability purposes and keeping track of things, just enter some Logic ride note here. And likewise with the aftertouch methods, we could do the same thing. So I've also added these ride choke _AT and PT notes in Logic, and then I could have these corresponding entries. Now in the case of aftertouch, all it cares about is the channel, and then that aftertouch message, if the plugin supports it, that'll choke any ride note. But with polytouch, it works on a note-by-note basis, so when you do that, just make sure you're specifying all the notes that it's supposed to choke. And then this PT at the end, that's for them all. That doesn't mean that this just corresponds to ride bell. That just guarantees that the poly aftertouch method will choke any possible ride note. So here when we looked at the crash right, there's only one entry because there's only one Logic crash right. So that's the chokes parameter, and to see that in action, I'm going to use Native Instruments Studio Drummer as the example. And so what I've done is I have the crash left set up to do just a regular choke using an articulation, and then using one of those notes that I created as an extra note in Logic the way I just showed moments ago. I'm having it do the choke using aftertouch, and then in the crash right cymbal, I'm having it using poly aftertouch. So in Studio Drummer, that sounds like so. Now, you may have noticed with the aftertouch option, nothing happens. That's because Studio Drummer does not seem to react to channel aftertouch, but it reacts to the poly aftertouch. And also, notice when using just an articulation for the choking, the length of the choke articulation doesn't affect the actual length of the choking. It's always going to be the same length. Whereas with the poly aftertouch method, notice how if we have a short articulation, it's a short choke, and then if we extend that out. So it's a good thing to understand how the various third-party libraries react to the different types of choking methods. And then likewise with ride choke, here are those notes in Logic that I invented, so I can do these tests. The first one, that's just with an articulation. And then it's not reacting to channel aftertouch, but then it does react to poly aftertouch. So now hopefully you understand how you can put that to use. The result of all this work is that now, using this Logic Drums to Anything script, you could have a Logic drummer track or some other Logic drum track and play back through whatever third-party drum library you want. So you can play it back through Addictive Drums, or EZDrummer 3. How about Steven Slate 5? Let's try Native Instruments Studio Drummer. So you get the idea. All we're doing is using the same basic script and just modifying the settings so the mapping makes sense given that third-party library. And not only are you going to have hi-hats playing back correctly, but you can also take advantage of additional articulations in those target libraries using some of the randomization features that I showed you. And you can learn more about using those possibilities by looking at the examples in the instruction guide. You can even use this to map a percussion library, as crazy as that sounds. So here I have a drummer track where I chose the Latin percussion player, and this is how it sounds using the Logic Latin percussion. Now, drummer uses sampler when he's playing back these Latin percussion parts, and if you look at this, it can be pretty daunting because of all the articulation switching going on. See all these articulation IDs? But no worry, using the same script and the same principles. As an example, I'll use EZDrummer 3 Latin percussion, so I'll open up the script. And so Logic is just using a small number of actual notes, but because of all the articulation switching going on, these notes are able to play back a wide variety of articulations across these different instruments. So all I did was write out the articulations in EZDrummer 3, there's quite a number of them. And then using the AID switch that I told you about earlier, I just looked at the Logic AIDs and tried to find a good compromise which articulations in EZDrummer Latin percussion match up well with articulation in Logic. And obviously this isn't a one-to-one, but it's pretty good. There are a lot of cases where you have pretty good matchups between these articulations. So that was obviously a lot of work. And the end result of all that is that I can now play that same drummer part back in EZDrummer 3. Now that cowbell part's pretty loud. I guess some people just couldn't get more cowbell in their Latin percussion. Anyway, hopefully you see the power of this script. It's pretty easy to use. It's pretty simple despite the complexity that it allows. And that complexity is made possible by just a small number of parameters. And once you understand the use and the syntax, then you can really apply this to any imaginable drum or percussion mapping that you have in mind. Now I'm going to show you how to record the output of the script so that you have the actual raw MIDI that's produced. Remember earlier we played back these drummer session tracks where we have the script loaded and then it's doing its thing in real time, processing the MIDI and then sending it on to the third-party plugin. Sometimes you want to just record the MIDI itself and then play that directly in the plugin without the script doing anything. So I'm going to show you that in the context of some useful testing that you can do. So what I have here, there are a series of tests that are just checking various types of functionality of the script. So for instance, making sure that these peculiar drummer articulation IDs in the 10s, 20s, and 30s that get produced for hi-hat opening and closing, that's working okay. And then articulation switching, everything's okay there. The snare and ride position control, which for plugins that don't support that won't do anything. It won't break anything, you just won't notice the result in the playback. And then some randomization testing using the static tom line, as well as choking tests. So in those tests, I'm looking at just an articulation note for the choking, as well as seeing if channel aftertouch can accomplish choking, as well as poly aftertouch. And depending on the plugins, some of these will work, some of them won't. For instance, EZDrummer 3, it doesn't do anything with a standard choking note. It uses aftertouch. And then other plugins might not do anything with channel aftertouch, but they'll respond to poly aftertouch. And in these tests, in some cases, I'm using these notes that I invented for choking. And some plugins will allow you to set the duration of a choke, and that'll depend on the duration of the choke note. And so to test that, you just change the length of the choke note, And then if a plugin does support choke durations, for instance via aftertouch, then the aftertouch messaging will correspond to the length of the choke, and then in playback you'll see if that had an effect, if it's a sudden choke or if it's a choke with some duration. And to do the recording, what you do is you solo the track that you want to process, and then you set up another track, solo that as well, arm it for recording, and then go under the track inspector for this track here, and choose the track that you want to record from under internal MIDI in. In this case, I'm choosing AD2 tests, which is this one here. And make sure there's only one track that's record enabled. And then under the scripter, if you look at the test scripts I've included, you'll see that they all contain these invented choke notes, just for testing purposes. And then in the mapping setup, I specify where certain settings are used for certain tests. So these aren't meant to be for real-world use, but in the scripts that have underscore tests afterwards, this is how they're set up, so that if you have a different plugin, you can see how the testing is done, set it up similarly, and then do your own sanity check on that other third-party plugin. And also, it's a good idea to always hit run script, just to make sure that if you had made changes, the script is running in its most current state. And I'll talk about these warnings later. So it's a good way to visually confirm that all is well, and I've already done the recordings for all the 4 plugins that I tested. So you'll see the CC data for hi-hat, open, close, the position control for snare and ride, channel aftertouch for those tests that use it. To see the actual poly aftertouch messages, you would just choose the region, go in the event list, and you'll see these P entries under status. That's for poly aftertouch as opposed to A, which is just the standard channel aftertouch. In some cases, this ramp might be reversed. For instance, other plugins have 127 as fully closed and then 0 is fully open. If a plugin doesn't support snare or ride position control, this CC data won't break anything. You just won't notice any effect in the plugin. And then after you've recorded, you can just play it back. See, now we don't have the script, it's just the plugin. So in this case, Addictive Drums. Addictive Drums is one of those plugins that does not use choke durations, but in contrast, EZDrummer 3 does. So in a given plugin, you can test that functionality really well through this kind of test. You probably noticed that the chokes weren't sudden. They had some duration, and that duration is determined by the length of the actual choke note in the input MIDI. And just be aware when you record the MIDI, you're not going to notice the choke note in the recorded MIDI, because when we're using aftertouch, we're not using a target note. The choking in the end is being done completely through the aftertouch. So anyway, just a good test to confirm all is well with any given third-party plugin you plan on using. Another thing worth mentioning is the extensive validation that I have this script doing, so that you are pretty much guaranteed to have correct entries. There's a lot of checking going on to make sure that you're not making syntax errors, that things are internally consistent, so that if you're naming an articulation something in one place, that you're using that same naming in another place. So syntax is checked, logical consistency is checked, and there are also warnings that they're not necessarily for game stoppers, but they might point out something that could lead to problems later on. So more than half of the code involved in this script is actually used for that purpose, for all the validation to make sure that you have a good map. So let's see how that works and the kind of things to look out for. So for instance, if you entered a bad CC number, you're going to be notified of that error. And also that's going to cause other errors to trickle down, because we're using CC number 4 for the hi-hats, but now it can't find number 4 in the CC ranges variable. So once we fix that, then all the errors go away. Also, if you make a mistake in entering your numbers, that's going to trip up an error as well. So you correct that, now you're back in business. If you make a syntax error in these articulation IDs, also going to throw an error, as well as a warning in this case. because our snare center articulation is expecting an AID entry of 1 and CC ranges for 16, but because of this error, that 1's not showing up. So you fix that, all those messages go away. Likewise, if you make a mistake in entering a note number, you'll be notified. And trust me, you will make mistakes in entering all the data needed for this kind of mapping, especially for large maps. These entries have to be alphanumeric for the articulation names, so if you throw in some kind of weird character there, that's going to throw an error, and that's going to result in logical consistency errors later on, because now the drummer to target variable is looking for an input called kick1, it's no longer seeing it, so you fix this. That also addresses the other errors that happened because of that. And likewise, if you had similar errors here in this variable, maybe you would mistakenly enter the same note twice. So I've entered E2 for both these. That's also going to throw an error. You've already used that note E2. It tells you where, so you can correct that easily enough. Also, for some reason you made a typo, you added some text or something, that's going to throw an error because it's expecting the variable named L and it doesn't see it. And likewise with this drummer to target variable, a lot can go wrong here, so there's a ton of validation going on. So you have an error in writing out a parameter name. That's going to throw an error. It's also going to tell you that you're missing the target note parameter because of the misspell here. So you correct that, that error goes away. If you type in the name incorrectly, it's going to tell you that that kick with an E at the end is not found in your target articulation list. Now that's different from making a syntax error. You know, if you add some unallowed character, that's also going to throw an error. So now you have a syntax error. And likewise with these input names here, so the same kind of validation is going on. Just pointing you out that you wrote that out with incorrect syntax. Now we fix it. If you specify a CC number that's not contained in that CC ranges variable, that's going to throw an error as well. So really, you have to be careful how you enter this data, and if you're not careful, you're going to get these errors and warnings. If you get an error in your CC assign parameter, that's going to throw an error, and likewise, and so on. And sometimes you get warnings which won't necessarily mean anything, but they point your attention to areas that might need some work. So for instance, with this hi-hat tip articulation, we're using CC number 4. So the script expects that if you're assigning AIDs and you have a CC number specified, then those AIDs should be in that CC ranges variable. So if we entered some other AID here, say 8, that's going to generate a warning that AID 8 was not found in CC ranges 4. See, there's no 8 there. Other types of mistakes you can make, maybe accidentally entering the same name. For instance, let's say you enter the same name here for Tom low 2 target note. That's going to generate an error telling you that you've made a duplicate entry. Some other warnings to keep out for: if you have articulations listed in this variable L and they're not being mapped anywhere, you'll be notified. And there are cases when you don't necessarily have to map something if the target library already has the mapping correct. But I think it's a good idea to map things out anyway. They can't harm anything. And if you have target library articulations that aren't being mapped, those are going to be listed just so you have a chance to see if you missed anything, you forgot something. And by the way, if you get tired of these warnings, if you know you're never tripping things up, then you can turn those warnings off. You just look out for this suppress warnings, set it to true. And now if there are warnings, you'll be notified that they exist and that you're not seeing them because you have suppress warnings set to false. So it's a good thing to set it to true. Once you've validated that everything is good to go, then you may as well turn that to true. So in other words, I've gone through great lengths to try to catch pretty much any imaginable error you can make in some of these parameters. And that's all so that you will be nearly guaranteed success in doing your map. That concludes this long, but I hope you'll agree, useful video. Hopefully in your music production conquest, you'll find this tool super useful. I think it'll quickly become in people's top 10 most frequently used tools. So if you have problems, questions, just put them in the comments or contact me otherwise.